Hi there. This is Mary Catherine Fleming, aka Protest Mom. I'm streaming this to my personal page too, because if you live in my area, you've heard me complaining about the Unhoused and how the most recent sweep has sent a flood of intravenous drug users into our neighborhood, camping underneath the overpass at Broadway and I-25. The numbers are increasing. And right now, the city has no plan other than to continue to spend money on sweeping them, which is effectively brushing them. Instead of containing the problem, it's effectively brushing it into our alleys, our garages. And I'm not sure how much longer it'll be before they're sleeping on the playground at my kid's school or your kid's school, because they are now everywhere. This is no longer contained downtown near the services. I'm live streaming this meeting here because there are two things that are happening today. One is the official city report on the Unhoused, which will probably include none of this information, and you need to see that to understand that this is right now closer to me maybe than it is to you, because I live closer to Broadway than you do. But it's headed your way because I've seen them on Logan this morning on Downing. This is only going to increase as the pandemic increases, and I'm nervous what's going to happen when the moratorium on evictions ends. So clearly, the mayor has no plan, and neither does city council. So this is my last ditch attempt to beg you to at least turn this on and have it playing in the background while you go about your day, because it's a really big deal. And this won't be in newspapers for another day or two. If ever. The only way this is going to change is if we use our voices, raise them, go directly to our city council representatives and say, hey, y'all, voting once every 4 years doesn't do very much. Granted, I know this last election felt really, really big, but if you're not doing anything on the local level in between, then really what's it all for? This is the stuff that matters. This is the stuff that impacts your day-to-day life. Whose president doesn't have anything to do with the number of unhoused on the street? Though if you really want to waste energy making the argument that if the other guy had won, this would be better, cool, great. Take that energy directly to city council, please, and leave me alone. I'm not the one that's paid to listen to your opinions. Your city council representatives are. The second big thing that's going to be happening in this meeting, there's an independent investigation into DPD activity over the course of the summer, and it's going to be released in this meeting too. So if you are watching this on Twitter and you're one of my protest kids, it's been a bad week. It's been a rough week. Monday was horrifying for a lot of people. I'm seeing more anxiety and depression than normal, and which is to say, like, we're dealing with a lot, but this is particularly heavy. So do whatever it is you need to do, please, to take care of yourself. And if that means not tuning into this, great, that's fine. I will be, I'm probably not going to be putting my face to this today with commentary throughout, because it's been past 2 days were really rough for me as well. What I will do is put commentary underneath as we go, and you can like, share, amplify, whatever you want, but please don't tune this out completely. If you are white, if you live in Wash Park, either the fancy side on the east or the west side like I do, this matters, man. This matters. I'm finding needles all over the place. I found pipes all over the place. And I say this not to judge the people for using it, but rather this is a problem that exists. It is not going away, and they are sending it into our neighborhoods, and that with our tax dollars, and that's not okay. The $7 million that they spent on sweeps in the past 4 months could have been used to build a structure where this problem could be contained, and I wouldn't have to be doing this nonsense. And just because I'm doing it doesn't mean that you won't have to soon enough. I'm the canary in the coal mine. But if you want to shoot the messenger and be like, and ignore, that's fine. Good luck figuring out who to call when you find this stuff in your yard, in your backyard, when your kids find this stuff in their backyard. That's where we are. I'm going to turn on the meeting now. I mean, all of that's true. Yes. What I'm trying to do here, though, a lot of people watching this, normative people with a whole lot of privilege. If you were to say, like, don't you care about the homeless? Well, of course we do. We donate every year. We donate to Goodwill. We donate. Our church does a lot. They're going to have an answer. They don't feel uninvolved. And what I'm trying to do here is remind them that it's not just about being nice. It's about a problem, a societal ill that is headed to their backyard. And this is my attempt to bring people into this who otherwise won't be involved until they're not sure who to scream at when this problem creeps up on them. So just framing the same issue in a very different way, because most people think they're nice. Yeah, I mean, I had this conversation with my daughter the other day watching The Crown. Margaret Thatcher thought she was a great PM. She thought she was a really nice lady. So that's where I am. That's where we are. Excuse me while I pull this up.
Those mixed in. So project details for the 9% LIHTC. With this and the 4% LIHTC, just know that there are some changes happening on the project as the GC was just, the general contractor was just recently identified, and some of the costs actually went down a little bit, and a couple of other changes recently happened in the cost of the project. And so a few things have been moved around. So you'll see in the Appendix A of the contracts when they come around, the sources looking a little bit different than this, but this is what we've underwritten and tracked to date. So the project is located at California Street and 21st Street in the 5 Points neighborhood. In addition to city funds, the borrower will leverage private debt, D3 funds, LIHTC equity, federal home loan bank funds, and deferred developer fee. The 9% part of this project is $19.5 million, or about $305,000 per unit. And between the two projects, there are 98 vouchers that will be shared between the Denver Housing Authority and the State Division of Housing. Just to kind of go over from the 4%, CDOH is contributing to this condo of the building. Otherwise, the sources are very similar with some owner equity mixed in. The total development cost of the 4% condo is $10.7 million, or about $316,000 per unit. And again, 34 vouchers split between the Denver Housing Authority and the State Division of Housing. So some project context: California Street and 21st in the 5 Points neighborhood.
Context, if you're watching this is near all the services for the unhoused, and where the vast majority of the unhoused had been before the sweep started that sent them into Civic Center Park.
And it's immediately adjacent to the Stout Street Health Center. And as you know, this is immediately adjacent to downtown as well. So lots of opportunities there. So moving on to the Recuperative Care Center, which is a very interesting hallmark of this project. So our resolution provides a $797,000 grant to the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless to fund soft funds for the development of a recuperative care center. And what is that? It's a center that provides
keep that number in your head,
up to 75 beds to individuals experiencing homelessness.
Because if you remember Mayor Hancock's budget,
clinics. It will operate as a recuperative.
This is the number I can't get out of my head.
7 years.
In the middle of a pandemic, knowing a second wave is coming, we are spending $3.5 million to keep the convention center open because tourism is one of our city's biggest sources of revenue. So we're spending a whole lot of money betting that the virus will get better magically and we'll be able to go back to having conventions.
There will be no
and doing and only spending not a full million to the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless for developing a recuperative care center that we've needed for a while.
New markets, tax credits. What's unique about those
not doubting
doesn't allow the project
the need for this or the use for this. We are in a housing crisis, about to face a much bigger housing crisis, and recuperative care is a piece of it, but it's not all of it, and it's not long-term housing.
D3 bond funds for some of the construction.
At this point, we are not rewarding people for not working. We are not rewarding people for using drugs. We are containing an issue. Public health policy is reliant on a framework of either control it, like opioid use, control it, get people off drugs, or contain it. Let them use it. They're going to use it. We can't control it, so we're going to make sure that they use it in a place where they can't hurt other people. We're not controlling it, and we aren't containing it.
Moving on to supportive services, these are structures that you're familiar with. We're providing 2 services contracts, and that's important to have 2 separate contracts because, as you know, we kind of do a cross default on those contracts such that if the services contracts are not performed on, then there's a default under the housing development contract. So it was important that they be separate, which is why there's a little bit of a delay. But it provides 2 services contracts to the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless to provide supportive services to the 98 units at Legacy Lost for 15 years. The services contracts for the 9% LIHTC will be $489,796. We believe that's the number at this time. For 64 units, and the services contract for 4% LIHTC is $260,204 for 36 units, so about $510 per unit per year. And the same structure as you've seen, CCH can draw up to $150.
Right now, there are 6,000 estimated unhoused living in Denver.
And can draw an advance of expenses rather than on a reimbursement
Conservative
basis.
Estimates have that number increasing by a factor of 10.
Management services must be available to residents of supportive
when the eviction moratorium runs out.
Including the following services: access to a multidisciplinary treatment team, housing stabilization, and linkage to community supports. Providers must have a budget of at least $7,200 per unit per year, exclusive.
Oh, where did I get that number?
Expenses.
That's the city's estimate.
1 staff member for every 15 supportive housing units, and supportive housing services must be offered on a volunteer basis to tenants. And in this property, 50% of referrals will originate from the One Home coordinated entry system. And then here's a little bit of the supportive services sources for the first 5 years. So you'll see in the first year, the budget of services is $875,000, or about $8,929 per unit, and increases about 3% per year. Some of the other sources include Medicaid, some from developer fee, cash flow, state funding, in-kind sources, and us. Services budgets include a 1 to 10 staff to resident ratio, and services budget includes a 24-hour front desk support. So the actions required or requested today are on Resolution 1420 for a $2.2 million performance loan for 64 units supporting the 9% project.
I know this is boring, y'all. I know it is. That's fine. Tune out. Do other things you need to do. Either wait for me to tell you when to tune back in,
supporting the 4%
or
project. And on Resolution 1421,
you can sit here and really pay attention if you want to.
Just saying. $797,000 grant supporting the.
I know this is boring. You don't have to give it both your ears. That's why I'm here.
Questions. And just to let you know, we do have John Pravinsky and Jennifer Cloud from the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless here for your questions.
Thank you very much, Megan. I want to welcome Council Pro Tem Torres and Councilmember Sedabaka to the table.
Sedabaka. Candy's here, y'all. Candy's here.
There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Megan. It's always exciting to see an additional supportive housing project. I wanted to make a request, and there's a question as well, but it's a little confusing the way that we present these projects sometimes, and I've made this request before, but you have a mix of AMI levels on your chart, but you don't have anything like an asterisk or an explanation on the same side that explains how many of the units will in fact be provided to people who are experiencing homelessness, and in fact will be provided to far lower AMIs because of rental subsidies. This is confusing for the public because it looks like the AMI levels in this project go quite high, when in fact we know that the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless is primarily going to be serving those with very low AMIs who are homeless. And so I think I'm going to ask you, I'm going to give you a chance to do it this time. And then I'm going to ask that, Dito, I know Derek is listening, that we consistently talk about this, because the AMI level, for example, the 60% of AMI level will only kind of pop back into existence if they lose the rental subsidy. And I know these things.
AMI is part of our city charter. It's where affordable housing is pegged to by charter, average and median income.
More slowly, and I looked, I don't think you have a slide that does this, but more slowly.
Or rather area median income.
How many folks
it's a moving target. If it takes 5 years to start a project, think about how much housing prices have increased over the past 5 years versus salaries.
That we're talking about it, and I know why. There's financing reasons, because you have two different sources of funding, but there's no slide that puts it together. So I'm going to ask if you can kind of go over it more slowly, and then maybe we can try to communicate more consistently about these projects going forward.
That's great. Thanks so much for clarifying that. There are a couple of things at play. First of all, CCH has a general principle providing multiple AMI levels to provide the ability of individuals to graduate within the same building without being displaced, as well as to provide for financing stability should they lose vouchers. So there are a couple of things at play there. Something that's important to us, as you'll see in our supportive housing services contract, is that we say that those funds are to serve individuals experiencing homelessness and earning 30% of area median income and below.
Area median income.
And that it is for 98 units of supportive housing at this site. So there is an expectation for, as long as we are providing supportive services funding at this site through that 15-year contract, that these units,
again, to be clear, 6,000 families, 6,000 people in crisis. This can help 98.
So
it's important. We need it.
And then I'm just going to ask that, we try to communicate. So what you're saying is that what we are approving today is a 98 units of supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. Over time, they may be able to stay as their income increases, but in fact, the day this project opens, it will be serving all people below 30% of area median income.
That is our expectation as we put these contracts.
What number is that expected to be?
Point that there's nowhere in the presentation that it makes that clear. And this is the most important question our constituents are asking, is where is housing for people experiencing homelessness? And so I just ask that we really talk about it in a way that
even if you're not worried about homelessness, this is why you need to worry about it. Where are they going to go? There are going to be a whole lot of them.
Should the vouchers go away?
Every street corner when you drive.
I want our community
sleeping on the streets, sleeping in the park, sleeping in your backyard.
Housing for people who are on the streets today, for people who are in shelters today. So thank you.
That's great. And thank you very much. I wanted to also just clarify, I forgot to in my presentation, that you will see a change in the resolution on the performance dates for the Recuperative Care Center from a November date to a January start date. So, it's the intent to start that on January 1st and run it for a 9-year period encompassing 2 years of construction and 7 years of operation. So just wanted to clarify that change happened late, just in case you're confused.
Okay, thank you. No further questions, Mr. Chair.
Just in case you're confused.
All righty, and looking here, no further questions from members of council. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Hearing none. Can I get a motion to move 20-1419, 1420, and 1421 to council?
So moved. Second.
Okay, I'm going to take Lynn as the movement and Kenichi as the second. Thank you very much. Any objections? Hearing none. We'll look forward to seeing Legacy Lofts come to council. Thank you, Megan, very much.
Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. And I believe we're going to move along now to a presentation on the Host 2021.
To be clear, I don't have a specific issue with this project. I have a specific issue with the fact that we're not doing anything about the crisis.
Ms. Fisher, welcome.
Nothing that I can
Thank
see.
you, Mr. Chair, and greetings to all of council. Thank you for having us today. We are so excited to be presenting to you the investment framework for the Homelessness Resolution Fund for its first year. I want to start just from a place of gratitude to the voters of Denver for resoundingly passing Measure 2B, which creates the Homelessness Resolution Fund. I want to thank you on council and our community members who worked to pass it. And we're very excited at the Department of Housing Stability to help invest these funds and get these dollars to work in our community. I also want to thank just all the providers and the excellence that they provide in our community day in and day out that gives everyone the confidence that we can do this good work in the community. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer Bice, who's going to walk you through this addendum, and then I will be with you again for questions and then the next part of the presentation.
Britta, good morning, Council. I'm happy to be here with you all this morning to talk about our draft investment framework for the Homelessness Resolution Fund. We have a relatively short amount of time today, so I'll try to move quickly so we can leave as much time for your questions. We'll do a quick overview of some of the key points of the ordinance, review our timeline and public input process, and then kind of really focus in on where the draft plan identifies investing the first year's funds and the process for allocating those resources. So ballot measure 2B, as you know, is a 0.25% sales tax that Denver voters passed in November. This creates a dedicated funding stream for people who are experiencing or exiting homelessness. We are projecting that the fund will collect $37 million in 2021 and an average of $40 million annually in future years. However, these projections are based on summer 2020 estimates, and actual amounts available will depend on tax collection, and projections may be revised in future by the Department of Finance to reflect economic conditions. So that's something just to be aware of, but we are budgeting in this draft plan for $37 million for the first year. And again, the focus will be on people who are experiencing homelessness or exiting homelessness. The fund can be used to support capital operations, maintenance and services in a few different areas, including housing development, rental assistance, and supportive services in connection to housing. Also can be used to expand shelter beds and support 24/7 shelter and day shelter services, as well as other supports that folks might need, like integrated clinical care, employment, things of that nature, as well as supporting those connections between someone experiencing homelessness and accessing those housing resources. There were a few goals that were articulated to the community and to Denver voters as part of the Yes and 2B campaign. That includes
Robert Goss shared
1,500 homes with support services
the
over the next 10 years,
MDI official state of the homelessness, and I'm sharing it here if you'd like to see it.
Housing and
PDF.
catalytic projects, supporting and regrowing our lost shelter capacity, as you've heard in previous presentations around the impact of COVID, and continuing to expand support services for people experiencing homelessness. Just talk a little bit about our planning process for this investment framework. The ordinance requires that hosts have a final plan for how the funds will be used by January 31st, 2021. The Housing Stability Strategic Advisors, which I believe Council officially appointed on Monday for their seats, is being seated now. We're working on scheduling their first meeting. But that body is charged in ordinance with reviewing and recommending the plan for the first year to Britta. And then in future years, the use of this fund will be incorporated into host long-term strategic plans and subsequent annual action plans. And of course, we will be coming back to council for approval on any contracts that we issue for this fund that exceed $500,000. Just a quick note of kind of our overall process and where we're at today. So we began stakeholder engagement in November, reaching out to service providers, supportive housing developers, residents with lived expertise, a whole range of folks, many of whom were included in our strategic plan process that we were in this year. We drafted the 2021 draft addendum that we'll be talking about in just a bit. And we're continuing that stakeholder engagement on the draft plan for this month. Then in January, we'll be meeting with the housing.
I guess it did get pushed from the agenda.
Along with our executive committee from strategic planning to review.
I'm being told that the
make
DPD
any
findings are
changes
not actually on the
and
agenda for
recommend the
today.
plan,
I didn't get
final
a chance
plan
to check
bring
it
by the required
before
date.
getting started because I have to work.
And this is just a quick snapshot of the types of stakeholders that we're reaching out to.
We're giving the PD pay raises and taking away post-employment health benefits
residents
and uniform allowance for
our
firefighters.
strategic planning partners.
In a year of wildfires, we are
providers.
taking
also
away
are
health
including those
benefits
responses we
for
got our 2021
firefighters.
Action plan survey to inform our thinking, as well as a new community survey that was posted Monday specifically on the use of this fund and tapping into some other existing tables like Anti-Displacement Policy Network, Neighborhood Development Collaborative, Homeless Leadership Council, and some funders that we work with. Great. So now to dig into, that's a lot of process. Now to dig into what's really the meat of the plan. How do we want to use this fund in 2021? The uses for this first year are really grounded in Host's overall strategy, just founded on our kind of core documents of Housing and Inclusive Denver, the 3-year shelter plan, and then also our 2021 action plan that really brings those pieces together. So we're looking at how does this fund really support those key objectives, and how does it address some of the feedback that we've gotten from the community survey on that action plan. And this slide definitely has a lot of content, but summarizes the key points for how we would like to utilize this first year of funds. The next slide has more of a graphical representation, but this just has a bit more description. So I'll walk through this and then we'll show the next slide with a budget chart. So there are a few key categories of resources that we think we're going to need to use the 2021 homelessness resolution dollars for. First, at the top, you can see we anticipate spending approximately 27% on COVID and emergency response.
I'm sorry, which link do you want to see, Estrella? You want
other funding sources like federal funding sources, for example, FEMA, to support COVID response. We anticipate that we may need some of this resource to support that, but certainly if less resources needed for COVID, we will reallocate those dollars primarily to the areas of housing and support services, innovative approaches, and catalytic development. For housing and service supports, this is really our area to focus on creating those permanent housing opportunities as well as supporting folks in their units. We anticipate spending 28% of the first year funds in this area, and it could serve at least 5,000 or 500 households. Next, shelter and services. So this area, this allocation area would really bolster our ability to do 24/7 sheltering, which we've done an amazing job of.
All right, so you want the link to the State of Homelessness report? There you go.
Spending about 24% of the first year funds in this area, which would support more than 430 beds in a 24/7 model and deepen services at an additional 700 beds so that we can really utilize shelter as a platform for rehousing. Next, we anticipate spending 4% on innovative approaches. So these are new and creative ideas from our community partners that we can invest in to better serve people who are experiencing homelessness. Catalytic development is our last category before we get more into the administration side. That would be 8%. And this is really focused on opportunities that combine shelter and housing. So what sort of projects can we do? Like if you have in mind like Arroyo Village with Dolores project that combined multiple uses on the same location, and looking to create at least 100 units of shelter or housing through those investments in this first year.
You're welcome.
Through the fund and the ordinance, Host is allowed to take up to 8% of the fund for administration. We are budgeting for 6% in this first year to really make sure that we are supporting the Host team to really administer this fund successfully, ensure that we can report out those types of things. And then we also have budgeted 3% for reserves. So a small amount of the fund that we would just allocate in case there are any unforeseen needs in this first year. And if that is not spent, it would roll over to future years. And this is just that visual representation in terms of how that pie breaks down. So this kind of is a different way to kind of frame what I had already stated, but you can see 10 million for COVID and emergency response, 11 for housing and support services, 9 for shelter and services, 1 million for innovations, 3 million for catalytic, about 2 million for administration, and about 1 million for reserves. And then really, how are we going to get these funds out into the community? Host plans to use, obviously, our standard city procurement processes to allocate these resources. That can include leveraging existing procurement processes where appropriate. Host issued a NOFA this year for a whole range of our services. So that could be one example, but we also would issue any new or amended RFPs for additional services or additional applications. In terms of next steps, we will be seeking public input on the draft plan. As I mentioned, the draft plan is posted to the Host website in both English and Spanish for the community to read. And then we also have a survey in English and Spanish to solicit that input. That survey is open until December 21st. And the link to where all of that content lives on our website is below. But with that, I will pause and be happy to take your questions.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. It is certainly exciting to see this foundation being laid so we can make best use of the funds that voters authorize. We'll start off with questions from Councilman Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jennifer, I understand from the presentation the way the funding has been allocated for 2021 in the different areas, and I understand the reasoning. I'm curious if there's been a discussion of what happens in a worst case scenario, not the worst, but a worst case scenario. Do you anticipate if sales tax revenues do not fill to the extent that we would like to see, and we're all keeping our fingers crossed for a good recovery, do you anticipate that wheel of allocation will change in any way, that a greater percentage might be shifted to maybe to more COVID response or to more sheltering, or how do you see a shortfall in revenue affecting that allocation wheel?
Here's a link.
Thank you for that question, Councilman
Well,
Flynn.
thanks, Brett.
I can help.
Evictions are
answer
happening
that.
now at Welton Park.
So
Awesome.
You know, the reserves do buffer us a little bit if we.
Here's a link to the
short on
survey if you care.
projections. Of course, with the Department of Finance on those projections, so that we don't spend more than we'll receive. I think the bigger thing that would impact this is the flow of federal emergency dollars. So if we are able,
If you want to read more about it,
more in federal emergency
or download the
resources that
presentation, you can
help
do it
us
here at
with
this
our
link.
sheltering mission, with the hotels, motels, and covering those costs during this pandemic. That means we would free up some more resources potentially that could flow to housing and innovative solutions and catalytic projects.
Cool. All right, yeah, thank you for thinking that. I mean, we're all hoping, and I've seen some encouraging reports on how the recovery may go. So, but thank you for thinking of what might happen if that doesn't materialize. That's all, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Welcome, Councilmember Black, to the table. And next up for questions, Councilwoman Kniech.
I'd like to defer to Councilwoman Torres first, please. Thank you.
Madam Pro Tem.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Councilwoman Kniech. 2 questions, Britta and your team. How you've done in the past in working with, I know we're going to be looking at the, or getting a briefing on the IGA with Denver Housing Authority, but there are other and smaller affordable housing kind of management and development companies or organizations like Mercy or Rocky Mountain. Do you work with them, or do you envision that expanding with kind of the opening of the door with additional funding to have a variety of footprints with other providers and developers?
For that question, Councilwoman Torres, I think that new resources will attract both greater capacity within our existing partners. It may attract additional partners and additional capacity. And it will also grow the capacity of this department to manage the procurement process and contracts. So I think all of those.
So Tay Anderson is
outcomes.
reporting right now that these apartments that are under 60%
I appreciate
area
that answer.
median income,
I'm
evictions are taking place at the Walton
some of
Street
those parties
apartments
because I know that
in
they
the
have
height of the
footprints
pandemic.
in and around Denver, and just curious how it's going to work.
At least 60 cops,
at a creative level,
2 sheriff
how you're
cars,
working with
30
all of the folks
sorry,
who are
2 sheriff
building
cars,
affordable
30 trash
Denver.
bags,
To be more specific,
and the number's
Mercy
growing.
Housing has participated in our strategic planning. We have a current
Great
project with them. Rocky Mountain, we consider already partners in this work. I guess
Please
why I
do
was more
screenshot
general
whatever
is
you need to
we're
get.
not making any specific commitment to any particular
Evictions
partner,
happening at Welton right
but
now,
we
you
will,
guys.
Be judging and
Long-term solutions are terrific, but we also are in a crisis.
I think there's already
I
been a
sincerely
great
hope this crisis has
2D
not hit your
input session
backyard yet.
that,
It's hit
Jennifer
mine.
was alluding to, where many of those providers were already giving some of that input into this process, and we consider we welcome many more people, and there'll be many opportunities between now and January to get even more input before this addendum finalizes.
Okay. And one thing
I kind of want to get someone over there to live stream. Can anyone, before like leaving the comfort of your homes and running out, it is really cold today, and we're not sure if you don't know someone there personally.
So with the new administration, I anticipate.
Let's see. Can you check the streams? See where Brian Loma is. See where Dylan is. See where Colorado People's Press is. This is usually or Vixie. This is the sort of thing they would usually be covering.
And hopefully starting to
the Welton Street apartments.
The next decade to where they were even because it's going to take at least that amount of time for the resettlement environment to scale back up to meet a need. But housing was a shortfall before then, given the very, very kind of finite amount of money that resettlement agencies have in order to house refugees. And Denver was really starting to lose the footprint that we were able to provide for them in terms of housing. So I would really love if there were some attention carved out for talking to resettlement agencies and to the state office that passes through that funding to them for kind of housing solutions over the next several years.
Thank you for that, Councilwoman Torres, and we'll certainly add that to our awareness and intentions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilman Kinich.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. If it's okay, I'd like to engage for a minute on the line that Councilwoman Torres was talking about. And I guess I understood your question a little differently, which is, so for 2B dollars, DHA is actually very unlikely to build any of the housing in this pipeline. So they have two particular roles when it comes to supportive housing for those experiencing homelessness, which is one, they have the $60 million-ish fund that is funded by the housing fund to purchase land.
Cross streets are
that on behalf of, or they then lease it to
2300 Welton Street.
That portion of the fund, they don't build any of those units for those experiencing homelessness. They simply are the land conduit. And then the second role that they have is to provide vouchers. They have, I think, 300 vouchers set aside to make the rents low enough on the units. We don't have enough with
24th and Welton
alone to get all of those units to be supportive.
Welton Park, sorry.
Homelessness. So these 2B dollars will come in and provide rental subsidies on
cross streets to 24th and Welton
in that pipeline. So I just wanted to clarify and see, if that helps to answer your question. So DHA probably won't build any of the housing.
I'm personally against sales taxes. I don't like at the point of sale because then that's a
portion of the vouchers they get.
That's hitting some people harder than others
to make those units affordable to projects. But they actually probably won't build. And so does that help answer your question that you were asking in terms of?
I worry too. I worry about other projections.
In what ways? Is that okay if I just go back and forth a little?
It starts to.
Nope.
Just
They're not talking.
wondering
So far,
who are the
nothing
others,
yet about the
who
homeless.
do
That
we look
the
to
350
as
that
other
were
players
swept
in this?
yesterday and
I
sent
think
into our
what we
neighborhoods.
see a lot is
There were
Colorado
54
Coalition
on
for the
Thanksgiving
Homeless, and
Day when I in a
more
quarter-mile
limited
radius from my
variety
house.
of
54
partnerships. And so
people I
just
fed.
wondering who else
54.
like,
That number is
because
increasing. There are new
I think
camps
what we
south
all
of Broadway,
observe
at
is
Broadway
that
and 6th,
the need
at
for
Broadway and
this to
4th.
be really widespread. And so I'm just wondering who are the partners, because individual
That, and I drove past
capacity
those yesterday
is
morning.
only going to be it's going to be relatively limited.
Yeah, so I can help to answer that too, in part because we track from my office the pipeline of providers that are looking to do projects. And so, there are a couple legacy providers like Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. A lot of the other providers come through something called the Colorado Toolkit. And I emailed council members a little bit about this when we were passing shortly after, actually, we passed it. Took us a while to get the information, but you all asked me who else in the region is doing this. Is Denver the only one building supportive housing? And we responded to you, and I can happily resend that email to say the toolkit brings together service providers, some of whom have done this before. So for example, St. Francis Center has done supportive housing before, and they are doing it again at Warren Village. But it also brings together new providers like the Brain Injury Alliance that's doing the supportive housing in Councilwoman Sawyer's district is an example of a provider who hadn't done housing before. They provided services, but they'd never done housing. And so they went through the toolkit. So there is this annual toolkit that, the state of Colorado funds. In prior years, Denver
Thank you, Taylor.
It doesn't fund it.
Thank you.
Full disclosure, my wife is one of the facilitators of that toolkit. But so the toolkit brings together providers and developers, and they're not always the same person, right? The developer might be someone you recognize from doing workforce housing, and they've never done homeless housing before, but they're going to pair up. So Brothers Redevelopment, for example, does not specialize in homeless housing, but they are the partner working with Brain Injury Alliance. And so because,
wait, did y'all hear that? Did you catch that? Keech's wife
do one tax
is the facilitator of the toolkit. Was it awkward yesterday in their household then when DPD congratulated and thanked Keech in that statement they put out for all the contract negotiations and all her advocacy work for them?
In your district, Councilwoman Torres did not get tax credits this time. So that project is going to have.
Can someone explain to me how that works?
So they, and so every one of those teams is different because they have to be. CCH or Colorado Coalition for the Homeless can only build one project at a time. So they absolutely can't dominate the field because that's just not how tax credits work. You have to finish one project and then start the next kind of. So I think that you're going to see, if you look at all the teams that we've been approving recently, so Warren Village was St. Francis and Blue Line was the developer, Charity's House was, the congregation and a developer. So every project has had a different provider, and that's good news. But I do think it's a challenge, right? So I think it's important for us to continue to support capacity because it's a really pretty technical, intense, process. So does that help a little bit on that question? Awesome. I just want to make sure to close that out before I moved on. So I wanted to ask a question of Jennifer or Britta about the housing and service support section. And you may not yet kind of have this level of detail, but do you have a sense for the 500 households? Is that using the entire portion of funding for rental assistance for existing units, or does that allow any funding for supportive service dollars for a pipeline of dedicated supportive housing? So, I mentioned we have these tax credit projects coming through. We have some money from the housing fund to support services, but I was just curious if the 500 units uses that entire portion of the pie or whether it leaves additional funding for supportive services in other projects that are dedicated supportive housing.
That initial at least 500 household estimate for the just under $11 million for housing and supportive services. While, as Britta mentioned, exactly what we fund will be the subject of procurement processes and those types of things. The estimate is based on a mix of different types of rehousing approaches. So it can include things like rapid rehousing that provides rental assistance plus supportive services for a shorter term, or kind of a permanent supportive housing which includes the rental assistance and supportive services over that longer term horizon. So we used a couple of different cost estimators to come up with that at least 500. So it can include a range of rental assistance and supportive services.
I just wanted to share back. I think that if you think about there being like 4 things that a project needs, you know, 1 is land, 1 is construction money, the 3rd is the rental subsidy, and the 4th is the supportive services. I think it's really critical that if all 3 of those other things line up, that the DHA land is there, you know, the DHA rental voucher is there, we provide some construction money from the housing fund. If there is not that 4th piece, the service dollar, it's critical that that be the first thing or the most important thing we fund, because it gets the project done, right? If you leave those 3 pieces hanging, and right now we can only fund 1 or 2 projects a year with the supportive service dollars from the housing fund. We already have a system for that. It doesn't take new setup the way that some of the other things that we're going to have to create will. And I just want to make sure that we are closely watching the pipeline and making sure that every project that is at that front gate gets those dollars before we are then allocating dollars to rehousing strategies for scattered site units. You know, my hope is we do get a lot of FEMA money and we don't need to use much of that first bucket. So that might also allow us to grow the number of people we can do in scattered sites. But I do know that, you know, I just think that, you know, because we have different gates, we have different RFPs and different processes, which I think is challenging. It would be much better for a project to come in and get approved for all 4 pieces at one time. It seems like you're bringing them through as contracts in that way, but they've actually had to compete separately for sometimes those dollars, right? They had a
William,
RFP
I made a
for
mistake.
dollars
It's Denver the
from
9th.
So you had one application for their construction, a separate RFP for services. It seems to me
I'm
we
jealous.
should just fund all 4 pieces together on a project at the same time. There should never
It's
be a
intentional.
question
This
that
is
you got the
intentional. This is the
construction
sort of
dollars but
elitist
not the
stuff
service
that they
dollars. That doesn't
do
make sense.
intentionally
And
to get us
then
to tune
move
out,
to
not
the
pay attention,
scattered sites. So I
or
just think that
trust
that's
them
really
to do
important
things
that
that we don't
keep that
understand.
pipeline moving as fast as we can. So just, you know, that little piece of feedback and hope.
Exactly. Again,
we
it's
can,
intentional.
We can make sure projects get done smoothly, because every
And by the way,
time
y'all,
we
I was
have a different
mistaken.
process, we
They are
slow
releasing
down
the
construction
the
of this
police
housing
findings
while
on the
people are
9th.
living on the
Oops.
street. So the urgency
My
is really
mistake.
great. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Let's check the list. I see no further questions or comments on this item. So says this is not an action item. We'll turn the floor back to Ms. Fisher and move on to the Denver Housing Authority IGA.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we bring up the presentation and slides for this one, just want to speak to the inquiry that we received. So this agenda item was at the request of council members who asked about the background on the city's power to own and operate housing directly and the relationship with Denver Housing Authority to own, operate housing on our behalf, and also about tools for long-term affordability by city and Denver Housing Authority. So these questions obviously have both a legal implication and also partner implication with Denver Housing Authority. So I want to recognize Ryan Tobin, who's on from Denver Housing Authority. And I also want to turn it over to my colleague within the city, Elliot Schaefer, who will start to lay out some of the legal understanding in this area.
Good morning, council members. My name is Elliot Schaefer. I'm an assistant city attorney in the city attorney's office. And I was asked to provide some of the legal framework between the relationship of DHA and the city and county of Denver, as well as some legal background to the city's ability to own and operate public housing. The relationship,
it's not being covered today. It's being covered on the 9th. My mistake. Sorry.
Revised statutes. There are 2 primary parts within state law that establish and set forth the relationship between the city
totally
and
concur.
DHA.
Yeah, awkward. No, not bad. It's awkward.
-4-101.
It's awkward on my part.
Is known
whatever.
as the city housing law, and there is 29-4-201, which is known as the housing authorities law. And that sets the framework for the establishment of housing authorities.
Everybody pretends.
Throughout
Everybody.
cities in Colorado, the process that needs to be followed, and then some of the legal relationships and rights and obligations, rights and responsibilities between cities and housing authorities established within those cities. The city has also the framework for between the city and DHA. There are also 2 cooperation agreements established between the city and DHA. There's a 1982 cooperation, an amended and restated cooperation agreement, which essentially consolidated a number of previously entered into cooperation agreements between the city and DHA. And there is a 2007 supplemental cooperation agreement. And those 2 agreements are currently in effect. The 2007 agreement applies to all projects that were substantially completed after the date of execution of that agreement. And the 1982 agreement applies to all DHA projects up to that point in time. The agreements, they recite a large part of what is already required in state law. So they state the tax exemption that DHA is provided for under state law, the exemption of special assessments, things of that nature. The 2 things that really jump out that are different from state law is DHA is required to pay a payment of taxes, a pilot fee to the city annually based on rents of DHA projects. And there's also an agreement that the city will provide services to DHA and residents of DHA projects that are the same services that are furnished to other residents outside of DHA projects. The cooperation agreements are mainly focused on what occurs when DHA owns a property. It is silent on any city-owned housing projects. And the next slide gets directly to the question of the city owning and operating housing projects. 29.4.107, it states that the city shall deliver possession of any housing project constructed, acquired, or leased by the city to the authority. And it states that the housing authority within that city shall operate and maintain any such housing projects. Next slide. And when the statute continues that in the event that there is a city-owned project and it is maintained and operated by DHA, DHA is required to maintain a separate account of rents brought in by that project and turn over any monies provided to the city, less any operational and maintenance costs. And I think the large takeaway from this slide or from the statutory provision are that the state statute, it contains language regarding the jurisdiction's ability to own and operate housing projects. This statute essentially says that a city can own a housing project, but if it does, the city must deliver possession of that housing project to the local housing authority to operate and maintain the housing project. And then any housing projects that are operated and maintained by the public housing authority, rents are required to be paid back to the city, less operational expenses. And that is the sole statute that, or the primary statute that governs the relationship between DHA and the city with respect to ownership and operation of a housing project within the city and owned by the city.
Thanks, Elliot. I just wanted to take over from here and just talk about the value of long-term affordability and why it matters so much to us in the Department of Housing Stability and to Denver. You know, it's really critical for the development of mixed income communities and the preservation of affordable housing to have that long-term affordability. It also helps us with limited land resources here in the city of Denver. It helps us to serve more households over time. And it also helps us leverage public, private, and philanthropic resources in a very effective way. And it promotes equitable access to housing, combating displacement, and giving people the opportunity to stay in their neighborhood, hopefully for generations. And it mitigates the risk of property converting to market rate or high cost housing to preserve the based on the market pricing at the end of the restriction. So if we have that long-term affordability, it really helps us to preserve and guard against these properties becoming market rate. Next slide. So the city strategies for long-term affordability, I think you've seen growing policy and contracts coming out of the Department of Housing Stability that go towards long-term affordability. One of those is the city-owned land sold to developers to meet city priorities at extremely low cost in exchange for 99 years of affordability. So we found a tool to help utilize land in a way that gets us that long-term affordability. We also have the preservation ordinance changes that were made that requires projects utilizing city resources to be affordable for 60 plus years. So that extended that minimum affordability period, but also includes a right of first refusal for the city or our designee to preserve that as affordable if there's resources available prior to its conversion to market rate. And the regulations also incent long-term affordability by waiving the ROFR if there is a 99 year affordability. So that is a way that somebody can move more quickly through a process, and time is certainly a factor. And then partnering with organizations like land trusts, where they also have that value on long-term affordability, is as part of their purpose of housing development. But all in all, we may need higher gap financing per unit for longer affordability. So just like you've heard from me before that you'll see less units potentially at the lowest incomes because it takes more resources, we also need to know that living into our value of longer term affordability also may take more resources on a per unit basis. As we look at how does that long-term affordability work with our partnership with Denver Housing Authority, we have an intergovernmental agreement that passes through the city's property tax to DHA to make possible the issuance of nearly $130 million in bond proceeds that were approved by council in 2018. And that's what we often refer to as D3, or Denver Housing Authority delivers for Denver. And since I don't want to say all those Ds, we often just say D3. And so that D3 agreement requires that they acquire land and property for development of supportive and very low income housing that you just heard Councilwoman Kinich speak to. And also that they have their own projects constructed on acquired land and property to be perpetually affordable. So anything that they do with this dollar really has that long-term affordability. And in practice, DHA records a 99-year ground lease on properties under the D3 agreement so that they retain the insurement, they ensure the long-term affordability and retain the ownership. So those are some of the ways in which this partnership works. So in conclusion, the city's been able to encourage or require long-term affordability in housing projects through our existing strategies. Other partners do retain ownership of housing projects to maintain affordability for an even longer term than 99-year ground leases or similar affordability instruments that are used now. And since state law governs the ability for a city ownership operation of housing projects, would require some further conversation and change if city were to seek to retain ownership and flexibility to partner with wider range of operators to promote long-term affordability. With that, I'll see if there are any questions for those of us gathered here.
Righty. Thank you very much for the presentation. I see Council Pro Tem Torres.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Can you remind me how the fee in lieu of taxes is calculated?
Under the cooperation agreements, it is the payment in lieu of taxes is between 5 and 10% of rents collected by DHA of housing projects owned by DHA. And it is determined by resolution of the commissioners and is payable no later than April 1st of each year. So it's the determination of where in between 5 and 10%, the determination of DHA, the Board of Commissioners, by resolution.
So 5 to 10%, they determine do they determine what we can afford? Ryan, I know you're in. I'm not sure if you have
Sure.
direct information.
It's it fluctuates on an annual basis based on the average rent collected from our tenants overall, but that is certainly something that is published in annual financials and then ultimately submitted to the city by that deadline every year. But in any given year, our average rent collected from tenant portion of rent varies based on employment. As you know, in most of our portfolio, both public housing and in the Section 8 portfolio, the resident pays 30% of their gross income towards their rent, and then DHA would subsidize the remaining balance between that and either an operating expense on the public housing or a fair market rent on the Section
8. And the model, the development model that DHA has now is pretty different from, I think, what it's had historically, where it was exclusively subsidized public housing. How does kind of the new affordable layers of housing that DHA is building for or market weigh into this calculation, or does it not? Because is it just the public housing?
I believe it's just the public housing. That's correct.
Thank you, Ryan. And I guess just my only other question is there anything else, either for Elliot or Ryan, is there anything else, given the new way that DHA is providing housing with those additional layers, is there anything else in the Colorado statutes that has shifted or changed in parallel with the DHA model changing? Or is it strictly based, our relationship is strictly based on the public housing that you provide, and the affordable and the market rate is separate entirely from what we ran through in terms of Colorado revised statutes?
So the only really notable one worth mentioning is obviously the property tax abatement that DHA conveys to other providers via entering into a partnership agreement. In this case, and in most cases, it's a special limited partnership. So as a case in point, like with Legacy Lofts project that'll be closing here later this year, DHA, through an instrumentality, participates in a limited basis on as a partner in the deal structure to convey that property tax exemption for the affordability. And in that case, we also then, on a cash flow basis, have a pilot tax that would be due, or a pilot payment that would be due if that project cash flows and is able to support its debt. And in that case, if there is a pilot collected, DHA also submits that back to the city.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Kinich, you're up.
Thanks. Can I just follow up on the question that Councilwoman Torres asked? Again, I get to follow you. Thank you for asking such good questions, Councilwoman Torres. When you think about La Alma or Sun Valley, the places, or where you've done, Hope 6 or Choice neighborhood redevelopment, and you've had public housing, affordable housing, and market rate. Can you just clarify, does DHA own or operate the affordable or the market rate? So the question was, do you pay pilot on those other two? But I think it's important to clarify what your actual role is in the other two. So can we just clarify that?
Sure. In our redevelopments of the historic public housing site, and through the receipt and award of either the Hope 6 or now the Choice grants, DHA and the community commit to building a mixed income community to do deconcentration of overall low income in any one neighborhood. And through that process, very similar to most affordable housing projects, we do involve a tax credit partner, a limited partner. And in Mariposa and Benedict and Sun Valley alike, are really our most recent projects and notable. DHA is the general partner in that partnership agreement for the term of the compliance period, which is in most cases 15 years, at which time then the limited partner would exit the partnership and return full ownership back to the housing authority based on how we negotiate those partnership agreements ultimately, but in conjunction, in alliance with the tax credit program itself. And so DHA maintains control, is the managing operating entity or oversight entity where a third-party management company is utilized. And then as the GP, we would still receive the benefit as the single GP in that case of the property tax abatement as well.
So I just want to say it back to you, see if I understand, but we've only covered two portions. So public housing, you own, you operate, you pay a pilot.
Right.
The affordable housing, you own with a partner, you operate, but you don't pay a pilot?
In that case, a lot of those projects are mixed income. So there is public housing or Section 8 in each of those developments. And so the pilot tax would still be provided if those properties were cash flowing per the pilot agreement as well.
Okay, and then the third bucket is the market rate units. I want to be clear, all three of these could be in the same building, but they might have slightly different ownership structures. I like to imagine a fictional couple floors are owned in a certain way, a couple floors are owned in a different way. I know it may not be that neat, but we have to simplify sometimes to communicate with the community. So for the third bucket, the market rate, does DHA own or operate the market rate?
Yes, we do own in conjunction, and in most cases, in the examples provided both at Benedict Park Place and Mariposa, the market rate units are part of the single partnership agreement. They are not eligible for tax credits, aren't included in basis when we're developing the amount of tax credits that would be available, but they would stay in that single ownership component.
Okay, so in some buildings, there's not really three ownership structures, there's two. And so one is the public housing, and the second one is the mix of market rate and affordable. Is that right?
Well, DHA would be paying the partnership the rent subsidy to allow for the affordability within the partnership structure. We do get a little more creative, I'll call it, in terms of how we use multiple sources, much like the Legacy project and our PETA project, where we start to condo out and have separate ownership, which is kind of what you're alluding to. But in both Benedict and in Mariposa, they are single owner partnerships, single ownership entities that control the entire mixed income portfolio. And DHA would be providing a rental subsidy check to those partnership agreements for operation.
Okay, and I think so what I'm just going to say it back again because I didn't get it quite right. Some projects have just oversimplified two ownership structures, even if there's different subsidy in one of those for some of the units. And then other projects might have three ownership structures. But in both cases, the pilot is paid for the whole building. It's not based on those ownership structures. I think the question we're asking is property tax paid on market rate units? That's kind of what I think I want to clarify. So, I think that, are we avoiding property tax by virtue of a market rate unit being in a building with affordable units? Or is there a way that the pilot is covering it? Or is it property tax? That's where I'm headed in trying to understand, whether it matters if you own the market rate unit or someone else owns it, right?
Yeah, in our opinion, if we did not own the market rate units, then they would be subject to a property tax. In this case, DHA does own the property or the market rate units, and those market rate units support the operations of the overall facility, including the very low income and the workforce housing that are in those projects. And therefore, it has been determined that those would be still exempt due to DHA's ownership of those particular ownership entities.
Got it. So I'm going to say it back one last time. So it sounds like because they cross-subsidize, they make it possible to have the very low-income public housing units and the affordable units. They actually are subsidizing other units that serve lower-income folks. They are part of the overall package that you are considering. Okay. Am I saying that right?
That's correct. That's how they're currently structured.
Okay. Thank you for answering those questions. I have a broader question probably for Elliot or maybe Britta, but did you guys research how common the state limitations or arrangement are? Is this a pretty standard thing across the country, or do you know? And then I'm just curious if you, in your research, got to any statutory rationale, like, what was the theory by which the state said, we think it's best for one authority to operate everything in a jurisdiction?
I did not explore other jurisdictions, so I don't know if this is applicable, if other states have a same statutory prohibition of cities owning, operating, and maintaining public housing. There isn't much. I haven't been able to dig into the original legislative history of this this provision. It goes back to the original enactment of the city housing law back in 1935. As far as I can tell, it hasn't been changed since that time. I would need to dig into the legislative history, and I haven't, with COVID, I haven't been able to access books. The legislative history isn't available online currently, but it's certainly something I can look into.
It's terrible how COVID has disrupted things
for this prohibition. But it's been on the books since 1935. It is applicable to all cities in Colorado who have public housing authorities created within their jurisdiction.
Thank you. No more questions, Mr. Chair. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Sotobaca, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And,
Candy's here.
Thank you for that explanation on the property tax. That was part of my question for the market rate units. I'm wondering, Ryan, if it's possible for DHA to put together an analysis over the last maybe 30 years of that split as the Hope $6 came in and the renovations of public housing happened. Can you show us the units annually for public housing, and then show us that shift as it happened to split it up into affordable and market rate?
Yeah, we could certainly pull that information together.
Awesome.
First efforts would probably originate in the Curtis Park redevelopment, which was our first initial mixed income, and then through the other Hope 6 awards in Benedict and Mariposa and now Sun Valley. So I don't know that we would need to dig back 30 years, but close to.
Awesome. Yeah, and that is the one I'm most curious about. So I would love that. And also, I'm wondering, with DHA or this prohibition at the state level, is DHA always subject to CORA, even though you're quasi?
Yes, we are.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. That's it for my questions.
Thank you. Council Pro Tem Torres, you're back up.
Thank you. Excuse me. And this might just be a question more for Britta, because I haven't seen something reflecting what do we know about we talk about we're building workforce housing. Do we have an assessment of what kind of workforce incomes exist in Denver? So do we know exactly, or have we done any kind of statistical analysis, whether it's with census or other data thresholds, that we have X amount of the city that makes 50% AMI, we have X amount that makes 40%, and then assessment within that of where housing stability might exist? Have we ever done anything like that to understand if we've got the right benchmarks or guidance for what kind of specific housing we need?
Yeah, so if I understand that question, I just want to repeat back a little bit of the parts of that. So you asked about analysis of incomes. Are you talking about household incomes?
It'd be real great to have that.
Wages for specific jobs within Denver?
I guess because of this conversation, it would be household incomes.
Okay. Yes, we definitely have information on household incomes in Denver. One of the tools that I like to use that maybe gets at your question, so I'll see if this answers it. If I'm off, then you can tell me. On the state website, they have an analysis of household incomes and how many households are there. They have it for the state, and it breaks down by each county. And then it compares it to inventory. So how many units fall within those income ranges, and it shows that for each segment, like 0 to 30%.
You'd think that each council district would have up-to-date numbers on that.
That is one of the things that I think really helped to show that visually, and I'd be happy to send that link around in response to your question.
What percentage of my constituents are at risk of losing their home and not being able to afford a new one?
If I might just add, Mr. Chair, it clearly demonstrates that the greatest gaps are at the very lowest.
Heard.
So that's where
Eleanor.
The most households and the least income.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got council members Kinich and Sitibaka back up, and I want to take a hard stop here in 7 minutes at 11:20, so we have plenty of time.
Hard stop before Candy asks her question.
Councilman Kinich, you're up.
Real quick for Ryan, there was a very small news clip about a selection for the new director of DHA, but I have yet to see any other announcements, emails, or updates. Can you tell us what the status is of the new hire and when we can expect to get to know that person?
Sure. David Navascotia will be joining DHA on January 19th with his official start date.
Excellent.
Very anxious to get to know all of you. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Sitibaka.
Just a very quick one. Councilwoman Torres asked about that inventory matchup, and it reminded me of the housing meetings that we were doing where everybody was split into groups, and there was that housing operations group. I don't remember what that process was, Britta, but it stopped, I think, because of COVID. And I'm wondering if that's coming back up because I feel like that was headed in a really positive direction.
I'm glad to hear that, Councilwoman Sitibaka. The strategic planning continues in now a more virtual form, and that 5-year strategic plan, we definitely had to swivel our efforts. And so we decided, based on the input of the stakeholders in those groups, that we would just do a 1-year action plan for right now, which we just presented on the addendum to that. And then in 2021, we would continue our strategic planning process with the Housing Stability Strategic Advisors, those ongoing strategic planning committees, and then the executive committee for the strategic plan. And then in November of 2021, we have to have a 5-year plan to bring back to you all for approval. So that's the new time frame.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. I was wondering that very same question. Let me make sure.
Where are you now?
Alrighty. Britta, thank you very much for the presentations today and the good information and the good work. We will now shift over to the Metro Denver Housing Homeless Initiative and welcome Jamie Reif.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to share with you the Metro Denver 2020 State of Homelessness Report and kind of walk through a little bit that with you today. First of all, a few things to note about the report is this is a regional report as the Metro Denver Homeless Initiative does serve Adams, Arapahoe, Boulder, Broomfield, Denver, Douglas, and Jefferson counties. So as you're hearing this data and thinking through and asking questions, just know that this is a regional report based on the fact that we do, in fact, coordinate and collaborate across the entire region. So before I go into the actual nuts and bolts of the report, I want to talk about the purpose of the report as it was originally intended, as well as what the report is and what the report isn't. So one of the first things that we wanted to do as the Metro Denver Homeless Initiative was to ensure that we were going to educate the public on data beyond the point in time. So one of the things that has been very prevalent in our community is using the point in time really as the data point for how we're doing as a region or as a community in addressing homelessness. And while it does serve a purpose, it's by no means the only data that we now have available. So
yeah, whenever I hear educate the public, I'm like,
bring that other data
excuse me?
And help us understand how much of an undercount the point in time actually is in our community. Because we've always known that doing one count on a single night.
I'll take it from her. I will not ever accept it from council member.
And now we can kind of,
Then Candy say
that we now have available, understand the full breadth of the issues. Second, I wanted to, as the author, identify key causes of homelessness and really talk about meaningful action steps that we can take as a region to address homelessness. The other thing that we're very dedicated to at NBHI, and we didn't feel any report would be complete without, was really looking to elevate the voices of lived expertise and the human experience of homelessness throughout this report. So what you'll see as you go through the report are actual call out boxes, it's quotes, it's insights, it's experiences from people that have actually been through homelessness that helps provide a much fuller understanding of what it's actually like to go through this. And then the last thing we really wanted to do is one of the things that I know many of us see as we're talking to people is that people have some stereotypes surrounding this issue, specifically who's experiencing homelessness, why they're experiencing homelessness, and then what we can do about it that is effective and evidence-based. So kind of the fourth main purpose of this report was to address some of those stereotypes on homelessness and bring the general public really up to date.
Yes, the problem knows exactly how bad it is. We got it in our backyards. Did I mention the needles that we found?
Really intended for the general population, community members, policymakers. It's not meant to be
needles.
A really deep, dense kind of report, but rather bring this issue to light through data and graphics and help people better understand the issue. So before I jump into the report, let's talk a little bit about what the report isn't, as well as what the report is. So what the report isn't, it's definitely not an attempt to publish a total number of people experiencing homelessness. I know many of you are very, very familiar with this work. And one of the things that's incredibly difficult to do with any report is to actually determine the total number of people experiencing homelessness. Rather, we have pieces of that larger picture. And that's what this report is really about, is about bringing together those pieces to give us a much more broader understanding. Secondly, this report is definitely not exhaustive of all data sources. There are literally dozens of other data sources that we could have included, but there were just limitations around that regarding kind of timelines on reporting, as well as agency level limitations. And so we ended up pulling 4 main data points, which I'll talk about here in a moment. And then the last thing I just want to say is this report is by no means perfect. It is simply version 1 of a report that we hope to iterate on and improve upon year after year for our region. And there are already things that I wish we'd done differently. But again, these are all things that in future iterations we can improve upon and make it more robust and comprehensive. So I want to talk a little bit about what this report actually is. So first of all, it is one of the first reports of its kind in the country. Communities generally have found it very difficult to be able to crosswalk this type of data, as well as federal partners have been very hesitant, as well as they've had a lot of barriers to being able to crosswalk these types of data. So what the report looks at, and I'll go into depth on each of these data sets here in a second, is the Homeless Management Information System, which is commonly referred to as HMIS, One Home, which is our coordinated entry system, which is how we kind of assess, match, and prioritize people for housing in our region, the Point in Time, as well as education data from the Colorado Department of Education. And then it kind of looks at these data points as appropriate across individuals, so households without children, families, and then youth homelessness are the 3 kind of major buckets that the report focuses on. As I said earlier, the report is also definitely an attempt to elevate lived expertise. It's something that NBHI is very dedicated to, and we believe that people with lived expertise should be part of all reports and part of all conversations and decisions made around this issue. It's also like just a more robust kind of holistic way to understand homelessness in the region overall. Like I said in the past, we've tended to focus on the point in time and not really look at it, what does homelessness look like for an entire year? Or what does homelessness look like for the students in our region? So this is a way, again, to bring together the pieces to give us a fuller, comprehensive understanding of this issue. And again, lastly, it's a means to highlight how kind of each data set contributes in its own way. And I want to stress in its own way, because there's a tendency to want to compare these data And that's not really what we want to do. We want to look at them side by side and together to understand this issue. So the report ends up being about 55 pages long. It does have kind of an executive summary section, which does have an overview and a data summary, which is meant to be a pull-out kind of standalone 2-pager, which can be used to provide an overview of the report. There's an introduction, which really talks through the purpose, the limitations, and another kind of overview of the entire report. It then also goes into the causes of homelessness. And the reason that we specifically made that its own section is, again, because we wanted to help kind of educate the public on the causes of homelessness, specifically in our region, and what the reality of the current state is for that. Then there's kind of a brief explanation of each of the data sources, a section with critical definitions, and that just outlines kind of terms that the public will need in order to understand. The next section, which is really the bulk of the density of the report, which is a crosswalk of data. So one home, HMIS, point in time, and then Colorado Department of Education data as appropriate for adults, families, youth. And then there's also kind of a specific section dedicated to explaining the Colorado Department of Education data, because so many are not really accustomed to looking at that data, because it resides on the education side of homelessness as opposed to kind of this housing side of homelessness. And then the last section really calls out some specific implications for our region and what we can be doing to meaningfully combat homelessness. So I'm not going to go through all of the graphics in the report, but there are a few key ones, and this one being probably the one that if people are going to pick up on things, this is where they'll turn. So this is the 4 data sources side by side, and I want to talk through what each of them means. So this is the number of individuals experiencing homelessness, and I want to talk to you about how they contribute to our fuller understanding. So that first number is the point in time. So last year in January, on the 27th, we obviously every year do this really robust outreach to try to understand who in our community in the 7-county Metro Denver region is either experiencing sheltered or unsheltered homelessness. So last year on that single point in time, there were 6,104 people counted in our community that were experiencing homelessness. Now, a lot of that data is pulled directly from our data system, which I'll talk about here in a second, which is the second piece of data. But we do conduct survey and outreach during that evening and kind of go through a series of questions with people that are experiencing homelessness to really better understand them. And one of the things that the point in time does is it's the best accurate snapshot of unsheltered homelessness, or those people living outdoors or in places not meant for human habitation. So this next number, I think, is the one that has potentially gotten the most attention, because it's the first time that we've ever been able to have this data. So about 3 years ago, the 3 continuums of care, which MDHI is one here for the Metro Denver region, got together and decided to adopt a comprehensive and the same data system called the Homeless Management Information System. So we did that as a state so that we would be able to track people not just within our regions, but also across regions with unique identifiers, kind of like a social security number, so that we would see their paths through, their journey through homelessness, what interventions worked, and how long they stayed homeless, or whether or not they stayed stably housed. It also allows the system, to track outcomes for programs and determine potentially what is the most effective for a person based on their demographics or their risk factors. So what we were able to do, thanks to the really hard work of our providers in the community who put all this data into HMIS, is for the first time actually pull data that gave us a year-long count. So what we know from the HMIS system is that between July 1st of last year and June 30th of this year, 31,207 individuals, unique individuals, accessed the HMIS system or accessed our providers for services related to their homelessness. So again, this is still probably an undercount as some people don't access services or supports, but this is a much more comprehensive look at it in a year, how many people are actually experiencing homelessness across the region. The next data is what's called our One Home data. So as I said earlier, One Home is our coordinated entry system, which works as a way to get people prioritized, assessed, matched, and then housed. So between that same time frame for HMIS, between July 1, 2019 and June 30, 2020, we were able to prioritize 3,481 people. And while this is obviously a huge difference from the number of people that were accessing HMIS for services, the good thing about the One Home data is part of the assessment is what's called the VI SPDAT, or that is a vulnerability index tool where providers sit down and ask people experiencing homelessness a variety of questions that give us a real deep understanding of their barriers as well as their journey, and helps us really get a broad and deep look at who is experiencing homelessness that is most at risk and what those risk factors are. So then the last data set that's included in the report is the McKinney-Vento Colorado Department of Education data. So in the school districts that are in our region, in the 18-19 school year, what we saw were 12,879 students experienced homelessness. Now, one thing to note here, there is a difference in the McKinney-Vento education definition of homelessness as compared to the definition used for those other three data sources. So that is one of the reasons why we see so many students experiencing homelessness, is that roughly 3/4 of those are students who are couch surfing or doubling up due to economic hardship or loss of housing. So that number is just a little bit different, but again, it provides a real good look at the family and children homelessness across the region. So there were some key takeaways as we looked at this data. One of the things that we saw was the glaring consistency in the prevalence of racial inequity on who experiences homelessness. That is the one commonality that rang true across every single data set. For example, with our HMIS data, American Indian Alaska Natives were 6 times more likely to experience homelessness. Black or African Americans were nearly 4.5 times more likely if they were individuals. Looking at family homelessness, Black or African heads of household are nearly 7 times more likely to experience homelessness. And that is compared to their representation in the general census data, or general population. The other thing that we saw is that the actual causes of homelessness are very significantly from public perception. I think, many of us are familiar with the fact that the main cause of homelessness, and what people identify over and over and over again, is that there are 2 main things contributing, particularly in our region, to household homelessness. And that is the cost of housing and the loss of a job or a decrease in their hours. That really butts up against what the public perceives as the main causes of homelessness, which are mental health or substance abuse disorders. And so really this report, we're trying to reconcile those two and help people. For the cost of housing is so high, the cost of living is the main factor, the main contributor to homelessness. So another glaring thing that we saw was the inconsistency in supports versus what people are actually able to access. So for example, Jefferson County did a really great report that came out last year. And what they found at their nonprofits that were providers for people experiencing homelessness was that over 66% of the people coming to their different programs were in need of housing supports, yet only 5% were actually receiving any sort of housing assistance, which again just really speaks to that huge gap between what's available in our community and what people need versus what we're actually able to offer at this point. So another key takeaway, as I said kind of earlier, just highlighting this fact, is that people simply can't afford housing in our region. According to, and I know we've talked a little bit about some different numbers here today, and I've heard some really great data that I've been writing down actually as we went through the meeting, is that when looking at the data that came out of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Colorado has about 115,000 units, a shortage of about 115,000 affordable housing units. And in our region, nearly 25% even of middle income households are burdened, and the housing wage in our region is $30.12 an hour, which, as we know, many people can't meet their housing needs And then I know one of the questions that we've gotten asked consistently, this report was released in October. So COVID obviously had started, but how is COVID affecting homelessness? So I think one of the good things that we've seen are the eviction moratoriums that has prevented many people from falling into homelessness, at least for now. The danger of what's coming is that these people are now 8, 9, 10 months behind in rent. And when the moratoriums expire, all of these individuals are going to potentially be evicted. I know at MDHI, we have a housing stability flex fund. We have seen about a 300% increase in the number of households asking for assistance, particularly with prevention, to be able to stay housed because they currently are unable to afford paying rent. So some of the implications that are in the report are the following. So again, the report has quite a few pages of these implications, a little bit more in depth, but it's really there's a need to create awareness on the realities of homelessness, who experiences it, and why people experience homelessness, because that really, as this tension exists between public perception and the reality, I think what happens is there's not a lot of public will like there should be to do meaningful things in our communities to really address homelessness. Number two, we at MDHI truly believe that the only way to end homelessness is housing, is getting people into housing. So making housing the focus of all programs and supports, and assuring that we are working together as a continuum, so that when a person becomes unhoused, or even before they become unhoused, let's prevent them from homelessness, let's divert them from homelessness. But when they do, let's get them on the appropriate path back into housing. Because as we know, that is the only way to truly end homelessness. One of the next kind of implications was obviously we need to respond to the affordable housing gap. It's really enlightening, and it's great to hear some of the steps that Denver is taking on this, and just continuing to build appropriate units that are, particularly designated for extremely low income households where we see the largest gap. And then, as I said earlier, really working to further coordination and collaboration as a continuum of care to create solutions for everyone. I think one of the challenges I've personally seen and research points to is that we've really tried to create this one-size-fits-all approach for people experiencing homelessness, and not having a person-centered approach to people experiencing homelessness, and making sure that we have solutions for everyone. And how we do that is, number one, by making sure that we have quality data. We are well on our way to getting there. We still do have some providers, who aren't using HMIS. We would love for them to use HMIS so that we can get every single person, we can capture all their data and know as a community what we're seeing, the progress that we're making, and the impacts that are working. Then we need to really make sure we have kind of this front door to homelessness to prevent and divert people, particularly with COVID-19, from ever even entering homelessness. So let's make sure we keep them housed. It's much more effective to keep a person housed than it is to rehouse them. The next thing is really creating low barrier shelters to navigation and housing. So making sure that we have, like was stated earlier, more shelter options, particularly to fill the gap that has been left by COVID-19, but linking those to navigation and housing being the ultimate goal. And then looking at solutions that fit different populations, including rapid rehousing for people with appropriate, so short-term kind of rental subsidies, as well as we've spoken at length here today about permanent supportive housing for some, particularly given just the housing cost here in Denver. So that kind of is the main crux of the report. I'll go ahead and stop sharing and then be happy to answer questions that people have.
Oh, you're muted, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Wright, for your presentation. A whole lot of difficult information to wrap your arms around. Let me see. Let's see. Council President Gilmore, kick us off.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Doctor, for the report. I pulled it up online and was looking to get a little bit more information. And first, thank you for this work and your presentation. You mentioned that 66% of people who need housing supports and who come in for help, only about 5% of those are receiving those supports. And is that, if you could talk a little bit more about that, are the supports not stopped there? It's hard to access them. What are those barriers, and how can we do a better job around that?
I would say yes to all of the above. Just to clarify, that was a report in Jefferson County that really helps describe suburban homelessness, which I think is something we don't talk a lot about, right? We talk a lot about urban homelessness, but we're really seeing significant increases in suburban homelessness. So I think, one thing we see is that 5%, it's really, there's a lot of barriers that honestly we create for people, because not all programs are, kind of that housing first mentality where we're going to make it as low barrier as possible to get people into housing. I think we don't have the resources, we just don't have the units literally to get people in. A lot of times we don't have landlords willing to take vouchers. I've heard somewhere between around 50% of vouchers are oftentimes returned, because particularly families have real difficult times finding units that will take their vouchers that they still can afford, even with the voucher. So, we're seeing a lot of turn back in resources. And so I think, again, the more people that we can, or the more providers we can get into HMIS and then into this One Home system where we're coordinating regionally, because what One Home allows us to do is not just look at the resources at my agency, but be like, oh, well, I may not have it, but at case conferencing this week, when we talk as a region about this family, I can match them with a resource at another agency that's more appropriate. Or we can move them as we need to through the process, maybe get them temporary shelter and then some sort of transitional housing, and then into some sort of PSH or rapid rehousing program. So I think, encouraging providers to be part of this larger response is something we can do to break down some of those barriers so that people don't have to, be on multiple lists and be going to all these different providers. And, it's burdensome for those experiencing homelessness.
I definitely agree. And I guess, you brought me to the next part of my question is getting those providers kind of in and utilizing the system. And I guess what is the issues or the burdens or what are the reasons why they're not opting to get into this network so we can provide better comprehensive care for folks?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's a couple of things. I will say this: if an agency is federally funded or a program is federally funded, they're mandated to be part of HMIS, which is part of One Home. Now, the flip side of that is if they're not federally funded, it's more of a carrot approach, and MBHI does cover all the costs related to HMIS, as well as provide all the training and the support for HMIS. But it does oftentimes mean double data entry, because you have your system that your agency uses, and then you're putting it potentially in HMIS, as well as if, say, you're a healthcare provider, maybe even some sort of third separate kind of healthcare record. And so for many agencies, there's double data, and, people on the ground, it's really hard for them to find the time to be doing all this data entry. My husband is a service provider and he uses HMIS, and I had to explain to him the why behind it, because I don't think the people on the ground understand the why. We've gotten much better as a region over the past year, but we're still not at 100%, which is where we'd like to be.
Gotcha. And are these shared databases? Or I know, with the metro area county commissioners maybe 2 or 3 years ago, especially around the opioid crisis, and folks, opting to call 911, and ending up going to our jails to get maybe mental health treatment or to get back on their meds, et cetera, et cetera. And that I know Boulder and some other municipalities were looking at kind of that shared database. So it wasn't, you didn't have an individual in 3 different places, but you had one individual that you could access that data and that information, and it complied with HIPAA and everything else around it. Is there something that is out there or that from the federal side could help with this?
Yeah, there's nothing from the federal side yet. I will say there, again, because HMIS, particularly in the last year, has become so prevalent with our providers, we're now going to the next level, which is that data sharing at the state level. So whether that be with human services or healthcare providers, and figuring out what we can and we can't share, and getting those ROIs on file, making sure we have people's releases. And so that's kind of where we are now. And thankfully, we're getting past the implementation and now going into, kind of that data sharing agreement, kind of phase. Because that also allows us to look like, okay, this person who's getting this intervention is also receiving, they may be having some justice involvement, or they may have some healthcare needs that we need to address, or, it just allows us to provide a little bit more wraparound for them and ensure stability long-term.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Sittebacher, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question. Jamie, you mentioned in your previous comment that we're not at 100%. Is there a list of what service providers are using the system and which ones are not?
We do have a list of who is using HMIS. Now, as far as who is not, I would have to get back to you on that. I know what we do have is from the point in time, we do outreach to several partners who aren't using HMIS, particularly for the sheltered count. So, one of the things that has been effective is funders, whether it be, municipalities or the state or even private philanthropists, is asking that as part of their RFP or as part of the conditions of funding is that the agency uses HMIS. So that's one, great way that people have kind of been encouraged to use that. But I can get back to you on the list of who's not and figure out how comprehensive that list is.
Yes, that would be helpful. Additionally, I'm wondering what it takes to become a user of the system, because I wonder, if our 311 system is in any way integrating the information they receive, or if 211 is integrating the information they receive when people are homeless and looking for services. And if nonprofits who aren't necessarily looking for a grant to use the database, but are actively serving, especially now through COVID, we've seen a lot of food banks pop up, and they don't necessarily want to do the work long-term, but they're tracking data that nobody else is tracking. And we need a way to get them that access sooner. So what is the training or the entry point for someone who wants to use it but doesn't have dollars to pay for it and isn't including it in a grant?
Yeah, great question. So we do work with a lot of those providers. For example, as the safe outdoor space or the winter sheltering pops up, we absolutely we train them very quickly. It's kind of like a 2-hour training for whoever the key staff member will be that will be entering the data, or staff members. I know, for example, this week we're going to be providing a special training session just for one of those kind of providers that are going to be starting and running short term. So we, as far as cost is concerned, there isn't any cost really. I mean, you have to have the hardware, but we provide access. It's a web-based application. And then we at MDHI provide all of the seed licenses through our HUD funding, as well as support from the state, which has been incredibly helpful. But it's really just reaching out to MDHI via our web, our email address, and we will get the people trained and get them using it very, very quickly.
Is it possible to get a training on the books for council members so that our offices have access to see where someone has been and where they are in the pipeline when they call us for support?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me ask my team and see, like, I don't know regarding like their release of information, who covers that. So let me look into that, Councilwoman, and get back to you on that.
Awesome. That would be really helpful. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Next up, Councilwoman Kinich.
Thanks so much. This has been really helpful information, Jamie, and I'm really, it confirms what many of us, in the community felt, that the real number of people moving through in a year is much greater than the number of people you might find on one January night. And so I think that having some scale is helpful, even though we know it can't be relied on as an exact number. I just wanted to follow up with the questions about HMIS. You mentioned the 2-hour quick training, but that's actually not the standard amount of training. And for example, there is a small women's provider that I know that has described it as a very costly endeavor, because you have to pay for the staff time, and then you have to backfill that staff time in the entity while they're being trained. It's actually not a small, it's not quite as small as the standard. So can you actually describe what the full standard training is? Because it's a little more involved than the 2 hours than one you just described. I want folks to have the full picture, because it might be easier, excuse me, it might be easy to say, every provider should do this, but those that are struggling with it have some good reasons. And I think it's important to have the full picture out there.
Yeah, so there's the 101 training, which is that introductory kind of 2-hour training that people will go through. And you're right, the staff time, I hadn't factored that into my response. That's a really good point, particularly if you're a smaller organization. 2 hours is a lot of time. So I was thinking more about the software and the hardware side of things, but yeah, absolutely. And then there is a 201 and a 301. After 101, you get access and can do some of the basic kind of data entry. So for example, our shelter providers, when we stood up the Coliseum, got the very quick kind of 101 training, and very quickly could just do the basics. So the basics is 101. You're not really mandated to be doing it, but you can at least put some data entry in and help us identify where people are moving and what services they're getting. Then beyond that is how you start to track some of the program components, as well as case notes and things like that. So absolutely, there's a 201 and then a 301, which go deeper depending on how much the agency is going to use it and what they're using it for, and whether or not it's mandated by their funding stream.
All right, I'm just going to push you just a little bit. I'm sorry,
perfect.
You're not giving a number. I've been told that it's 14 hours minimum training for an agency that wants to use this system as an agency. So is that accurate? 14 hours was something I've been told by providers.
I'd have to get back to you. I'd have to talk to our trainer and find out the exact number of hours that it is. That's a great question.
Okay. I just think it, again, you're making it sound really easy, but that is not how providers experience or describe it. And so I just want to make sure their voice and the things that they experience are part of the conversation, because that is a little different than standing up an emergency shelter versus saying my small agency wants to be part of this system, right? In the first case, they're putting information in, but they're not getting information out. They're not really a full part of the system, right? And I think for a small agency that provides services year round to be a part of it, the time obligation is more than just 1 2-hour training. And I just don't want folks leaving this thinking it's that easy, because it's they describe it as a far more involved process. There are follow-up audits and things that are required. And so I want that full picture to be accurate, because it is really important and valuable information. And at a certain point, we as a city, just like good outreach, if we want to have good data, we need to compensate organizations for the time it takes to do all the pieces, not just the first 2-hour training, but for the backup work and the retraining, because staff change over a lot in these nonprofits. It's not a 1 2-hour training for one staff member. You might have 8 staff members who each need it, and they might have a 50% turnover rate each year, right? And then you have the person who administers the program. And so I just think that, again, there is value to this, and I love the idea of expanding it. We as a city, or MDHI as a region, might need to compensate organizations for that time and effort, because those are the places where providers are choosing, do I sit down and keep my staff ratio in a shelter for safety? Do I sit down and do one-on-one case management during the 1 hour I have before people are released in the morning after they get done eating breakfast? Or do I do these other things? So those are the real life trade-offs. And so again, very valuable system, very valuable data, but a little bit harder, I think, than we're talking about today.
Yeah, thank you for that. It is really important. I think that's important feedback. I know particularly one of the good things about COVID is it's caused us to do some process improvement with the training side of things. and made it perhaps a little bit more streamlined. But I'll definitely reach out to our trainer and just see what the minimum kind of like what the hour commitment is if you want to become fully trained.
All right, thank you. Let's see, seeing no further questions, I do have a couple of, bring this down to real layman's terms, the kind of questions I get all the time at neighborhood meetings. You know, I remember hearing a couple of years ago that the fastest growing sector of the population of people experiencing homelessness was senior women. Whether or not that was true at that time, is there a fastest growing sector of the population experiencing homelessness that you could identify at this point?
You know, I think COVID has changed that quite a bit. I will say that. I think one of the things, and this is anecdotal at this point, I want to caveat this is anecdotal, but in what we've seen is that there's a lot more families experiencing homelessness who, you know, their main income earner may have been in the service sector and they were teetering on the edge for, you know, a long period of time or one paycheck away from homelessness. And now due to COVID-19, you know, can no longer afford to be stably housed. I saw a report this morning that, you know, 1 in 4 students last year that were identified as homeless, we now can't find. And I would guess it's very similar here in Colorado. So I think in a lot of ways, this is particularly hitting households with children much harder than perhaps it has in the past, just because a lot of, you know, parents are having to choose between working and staying home with their children and making sure that they can be schooled appropriately. I'm sure many of you are dealing with that, you know, that difficulty and that challenge right now. And these are people that, you know, to begin with couldn't afford not to work or, you know, have a luxury of being able to make that a choice, but not have it be a one that's made for them. So I would say right now, I you know, seniors are definitely one of the fastest growing populations, but I would say in light of COVID, families have been deeply impacted by the COVID pandemic.
Sure. Another thing I wanted to run by you, speaking with one of the folks from the city very involved in this topic, again, a couple of years ago, asking, well, so what is the breakdown of, you know, people experiencing homelessness because they've had a bad break, as you described, from one form or the other, or as opposed to that sector of people who are struggling with chronic mental health or substance abuse issues. And at that time, he told me, well, it's probably maybe 15 to 20% at most are dealing with mental health or substance abuse. Is that somewhere in the ballpark as you would describe that breakdown, man?
Absolutely. Yeah, we usually say about 1 in 7.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things. So one of the things I think is important that's in the report is a breakdown of specifically that. So things like co and trimorbidity as well, because we have a lot of people that are suffering from, you know, a mental health concern plus drug and alcohol abuse, sure, or, you know, plus a physical disability or 2 out of 3 of the factors. So when you look at that, like if you look at someone, and this is, you know, I'm just speaking to adults right now, like kind of the adult population, the visible homelessness, as you will. So if you look at that, it's about 1 in 7. And then, yeah, go ahead.
No. Please, I was just going to say, my guess is, again, from my conversations with people who aren't involved in really digging into these numbers, is they would probably guess it's the exact other way around, that 6 out of 7 are dealing with mental health or substance issues.
I have to hop
to clarification.
My next thing, because I got more going on. There you go. And we're in a crisis. There is a tent encampment in District 7, and what looked like last night might be a second one setting up on Broadway. There are several setting up further north on Broadway in the Baker neighborhood, but we have one here and are getting a second. And the one near me is full of IV drug users. So City Council on homelessness is not doing anything to address the crisis. In the middle of this meeting, evictions started at Wilton Park up in 5 Points, which is affordable housing. So I don't know. I kind of want some solutions. So I'm going to continue screaming at the mayor, but at least you can say you've been warned. If you live in this area, this is what you do, and this is how you do it. You show up at City Council, you talk to our rep, Jolyn Clark, or you go on Legistar and you find your rep and you yell at them and say, what are you doing about this? Because something needs to be done. It's not about rewarding drug users with a free house. It's about containing the problem and keeping them out of our backyards because they're being swept. Their big camp, 350 people yesterday was swept. They are now moving south. They got nowhere to go because you see they're homeless. And with the pandemic, evictions are increasing. Point proven by the evictions that were occurring during this broadcast. It's going to get worse or it gets better.